Chippewa Valley, Wisconsin, September 1876. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn, a warning carried on the scent of turning leaves and damp earth. For the settlers scattered along the river, it was a time of frantic preparation, a race against the coming cold. They laid in stores, chinked the gaps in their cabins with mud and moss, and stacked cord after cord of oak and maple. And they watched Anders Lindqvist. What the Swede was building made no sense. On a cleared plot of land overlooking the river bend, not one but two small cabin foundations sat parallel to each other, separated by a gap of no more than 4 feet. Between them, rising from the very earth, was the beginning of a monstrous stone structure. It was a chimney, that much was clear, but its placement was an act of profound foolishness. Though every man in the valley knew you built a chimney on an exterior wall to keep the fire from consuming your home. Anders was building his in the dead center of his strange, divided homestead. Harmon Briggs, the owner of the general store, and a man whose opinion carried the weight of goods credited and winters survived, stood with a small group of onlookers, his arms crossed. He's building 2 homes for the price of 2, but plans to heat them with the fire of 1, Briggs declared, not to Anders but to the men beside him, Silas Croft and Jebediah Stone. It's simple arithmetic. You split a fire between 2 cabins, each cabin gets half the heat. He's inventing a way to be twice as cold for twice the effort. Silas grunted in agreement, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. Damnedest thing I ever saw. That chimney's going to shed more heat to the squirrels than it does to his family. It's pure madness. Anders heard them. He had to. The sound of their voices carried easily in the still air. But he gave no sign. He remained bent over his work, his hands, strong and calloused, carefully selecting a piece of fieldstone. He tested its weight, turned it over, and then settled it into a bed of clay and sand mortar with a quiet finality. He did not argue. He did not defend. He simply built. His silence was more infuriating to the onlookers than any argument could have been. It was the silence of a man who possessed a secret he felt no need to share. What did this quiet Swede, a former builder of strange ceramic stoves in a land of endless forests, he understand about the fundamental physics of radiation that men who had survived a dozen Wisconsin winters had completely missed? This story is about more than just a clever design. It's about a different way of seeing a problem, a way born from a different tradition. It's about the unseen forces that govern our survival, and how sometimes the most radical idea is also the most ancient. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand the profound difference between heating the air and heating your home, and why one is a fool's errand and the other is the key to true comfort. So stick with me, and if you've ever had an idea that everyone else called crazy, tell us about it in the comments below. Anders Lindqvist was not a carpenter. He had learned the craft of cabin building through harsh necessity. Okay, his hands clumsy at first with the axe and the adze. He was not a farmer, though he worked a small plot of land to feed his family. In his former life in the province of Småland, he had been a kekelungsmakare. His world had not been one of rough-sawn lumber and open hearth fires, but of fire-clay bricks, glazed ceramic tiles, and intricate winding flue channels designed to capture every last wisp of heat from a fire. He had worked with tools of precision, calipers, trowels, levels. His art was in the slow, patient accumulation of thermal mass, in building beautiful, towering stoves that would sip a small armload of wood and radiate gentle, steady warmth for 24 hours. He had come to America with his wife Elin and their 2 small children, Carl and Sophia, seeking land and opportunity. What they found in the Chippewa Valley was land, yes, but also a winter of a ferocity they had never imagined. Their first cabin, built hastily in the fall of 1875, was a standard affair. A single room, a stone fireplace on the north wall, and gaps in the chinking that no amount of mud could seem to seal. That first winter had been a lesson in failure, a slow, grinding misery that had etched itself into Anders's memory. He remembered the specific moments of defeat with painful clarity. He remembered the day Elin had to use a hammer to chip a skin of ice from the inside of the iron door hinges just to get the door to swing open. He remembered ladling hot soup into bowls, only to have it turn lukewarm on the short journey from the cast iron stove to the small wooden table where the children sat shivering in their coats. The cold was a thief, stealing the heat from their food before they could eat it. The worst was the nights. They would huddle together under a mountain of wool blankets and animal hides, the fire roaring in the hearth. Yet by dawn, the cold would have seeped into everything. Anders remembered waking to find the edges of their bedding stiff and frosted with frozen breath. The very air seemed to crackle with cold. They had burned through 8 cords of wood, a staggering amount, yet they were never truly warm. They were merely less frozen. Anders, the man who had built heating systems that could warm minor manor houses in Sweden, could not keep his own family from shivering in a one-room cabin. The shame of it was a cold spot in his own heart, one that no fire could touch. He had failed them. He would not fail them again. The problem, as Anders came to understand it, was not the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the cabins themselves. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was fundamentally flawed. Harmon Briggs lived in what was considered a fine home, 2 stories, with a large stone chimney on each end. He burned wood with abandon, his chimneys pluming smoke day and night. Yet his wife still complained of drafts, and on the coldest nights, they sealed off the upper floor entirely, the whole family living in the kitchen to be near the cook stove. The failure was rooted in a misunderstanding of heat itself. A standard frontier fireplace was a terribly inefficient machine. It heated primarily through 2 methods, direct radiation and convection. The direct radiation was simple. The light and infrared energy from the flames warmed whatever was directly in its path. If you stood in front of the fire, your face and shins would roast while your back remained cold. It was the illusion of warmth. The second method, convection, was even more wasteful. The fire heated the air in the firebox, which then rose up the chimney. This process pulled vast quantities of air from the cabin itself, air that the family had just spent precious firewood to heat. For every cubic foot of hot air that went up the flue, a cubic foot of frigid, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air was pulled in through a dozen unseen cracks in the walls and floor. The fire, meant to warm the house, was actively making it colder by creating its own drafts. And the chimney, the very symbol of the hearth? On a conventional cabin, it was built on an outside wall. The massive stones would absorb a tremendous amount of heat from the fire, just as they were meant to. But where did that heat go? It radiated outwards, into the merciless Wisconsin winter. The back and sides of a frontier chimney did a magnificent job of melting snow and warming the frozen wilderness, while the family inside huddled close to the hearth, fighting for the scraps of heat that happened to radiate into the room. Anders watched his neighbors and saw this cycle of waste everywhere. They were fighting the winter with brute force, throwing endless cords of wood at a problem that required elegance, not effort. They were trying to heat the air in a leaky box, an impossible task. Anders knew you didn't heat the air. You heated the mass. Yet the construction of the Lindqvist homestead became the primary entertainment for the valley that autumn. Anders and Elin, working together, first raised the walls of the 2 small cabins. They were modest structures, each 16 by 20 feet, built of tightly fitted hand-hewn logs. But it was the structure between them that drew all the attention. The chimney base was a solid 8-foot square of granite fieldstone, rising from a foundation that went 4 feet into the earth, below the frost line. Anders chose each stone with the eye of a sculptor, fitting them together with minimal mortar. This was not a simple stack of rocks. It was an interlocking puzzle. Harmon Briggs, stopping by on his way back from a delivery, watched Anders for a solid hour. "You're using twice the stone you need, Lindqvist," Briggs said, unable to contain his practical objections. "And your firebox is too small. You'll never get a proper blaze going in that little hole." He pointed to the small, arched opening Anders had left at the base of the chimney, facing into the 4-foot breezeway between the cabins. Anders paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. "A proper blaze is for show," he said, his English still thick with the rhythms of his native tongue. "A slow fire is for heat." He turned back to his work, his message clear. The conversation was over. Inside the chimney, Anders was not building a simple, straight flue. He was creating a labyrinth. Using flatter stones and a special mortar mix heavy with fire clay he'd found in a nearby riverbed, he constructed a serpentine path for the smoke and hot gases. The flue snaked back and forth inside the massive stone structure, doubling, then tripling the distance the hot gas had to travel before it could escape into the sky. He was forcing the smoke to slow down, to linger, to give up its heat to the tons of surrounding stone. His neighbors saw only a man building a chimney. Anders saw a battery. He was building a device to store heat, a thermal flywheel that would smooth out the violent cycle of a roaring fire, followed by dying embers. Elin worked beside him, mixing the mortar, handing him the smaller stones. She trusted him, but even she found the project strange. "The women in town think we are building 2 separate houses, Anders," she said one evening, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Briggs asked if we had a fight." Anders smiled. A rare sight. "Let them talk. We are not building 2 houses. We are building one warm home with a quiet place in the middle." As the structure rose, the mockery intensified. It was now clear that the interior wall of each cabin was, in fact, the stone of the chimney itself. There was no gap, no insulation. The raw, massive stonework would form the entire eastern wall of one cabin and the western wall of the other. "He's put the coldest part of the house on the inside," Jebediah Stone exclaimed to anyone who would listen at Briggs's store. "Every man knows a stone wall in winter bleeds the heat right out of a room. His children will be able to stick their tongues to the wall and get them stuck, right in their own parlor." Briggs, leaning on his counter, delivered the final damning verdict. "It's a fool's bargain. He shares the fire, he halves the heat. He puts the chimney inside. He invites the cold in. By January, he'll be begging to buy one of my Franklin stoves on credit, and I'll sell it to him. I'm not a monster." The men around him nodded. It wasn't a question of if Anders would fail, but when. The science that Anders Lindqvist understood in his bones was the science of thermal radiation. His critics, men of immense practical skill, understood heat in a more direct, intuitive way. For them, heat was the fire itself, the hot air shimmering above a stove. For Anders, that was merely the source. The real work was done by the invisible waves of energy that flowed from any warm object to any cooler object. Think of the sun. It does not warm the vacuum of space. It warms the earth by bathing it in electromagnetic radiation. When that radiation strikes the planet, the energy is absorbed, and the ground gets warm. And that warm ground then radiates its own heat, warming the air. Anders was building a small, man-made sun in the center of his home. A conventional fireplace is a wasteful radiator. Its primary radiating surface, the hot coals and flames, is small. And because of the powerful draft, most of the heat energy produced is in the form of superheated gas, convection, which is immediately lost up the chimney. A typical fire might generate 50,000 BTUs of energy per hour, but a shocking 80%, or 40,000 BTUs, goes straight up the flue to warm the owls. The cabin receives only the small fraction of radiant heat that escapes the firebox opening. Anders's design flipped this equation on its head. The serpentine flue system was a heat exchanger. As the 1,000-degree Fahrenheit gases from the fire worked their way through the stone labyrinth, their temperature dropped dramatically. By the time the smoke exited the top of the chimney, it was barely 250 degrees. All that lost energy, tens of thousands of BTUs, had been transferred into the stone. The chimney's mass, all 8 tons of it, slowly and steadily absorbed this energy. This is the principle of thermal mass. A dense material like stone can hold a vast amount of heat energy. Anders's chimney was, in effect, a massive low-temperature radiator. Once it was fully heated, its entire surface area, the hundreds of square feet forming the interior walls of both cabins, would begin to radiate that stored energy. It wouldn't be a blast of heat like an open fire. It would be a gentle, pervasive warmth, like the feeling of standing in the sun on a cool day. The stone surfaces would radiate at a constant 80 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This radiant energy wouldn't primarily heat the air. It would travel through the air and be absorbed by every other surface in the room: the wooden floors, the table, the beds, the bodies of the people themselves. Everything in the room would become warm to the touch. The result is a profound and stable comfort that heating the air can never achieve. Harmon Briggs's objection that sharing the fire would halve the heat was based on a misunderstanding of the system. Anders wasn't splitting one fireplace. He was using one fire to charge a single, massive heating element that served 2 spaces. The fire's only job was to load the stone with BTUs. The stone's job was to release those BTUs into the living spaces. And because the stone had 2 interior faces instead of 1, it simply did its job in 2 directions at once. The efficiency was not halved, it was nearly doubled. Because there was no exterior wall for the heat to escape through, all the radiated energy went directly into the living spaces. It was a closed loop of remarkable elegance. That November, winter arrived not as a gentle descent, but as an invasion. A polar outbreak, a vast lobe of Arctic air, slid down from Canada and settled over the upper Midwest. For 14 consecutive days, the temperature in the Chippewa Valley never rose above 0. For most of that time, it hovered between 20 and 40 degrees below. The wind was a constant physical pressure, scouring every exposed surface and driving the cold into the tiniest crack. The valley hunkered down. Smoke poured from every chimney, a sign of the furious, losing battle being waged against the cold inside. The family of Sean O'Connell, who had built a new cabin a quarter-mile from Anders, was burning through their woodpile at an alarming rate. Their windows were opaque with a thick layer of interior frost, and they had hung blankets over the doors and windows to try and slow the drafts. Their children lived in a small huddle around the fireplace, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned. At Harmon Briggs's store, the pot-bellied stove glowed cherry red, yet anyone standing more than 6 feet away felt the chill. Briggs was doing a brisk business in wool blankets, heavy socks, and tellingly, patent medicines for coughs and lung complaints. But at the Lindqvist homestead, a strange peace reigned. The single central chimney puffed only a thin, lazy trail of smoke, a sign of the slow and efficient fire Anders kept burning in the breezeway. Inside the 2 cabins, the air was still and quiet. The temperature was a steady, unbelievable 68 degrees. There were no drafts, because the house did not need to suck in cold air to feed a roaring fire. The stone wall that formed the spine of each home was warm to the touch, a massive, silent engine of comfort. The contrast between the 2 realities was absolute. In the O'Connell cabin, A bucket of water left by the door froze solid in under an hour. In the Lindqvist cabin, Elaine had a small pot of herbs growing on a windowsill, their green leaves unfurling in the gentle warmth. In Briggs's fine house, the ink in his inkwell on his desk turned to slush. At Anders's table, 10-year-old Carl and 8-year-old Sophia sat on the floor in their stocking feet, drawing on slate boards, their fingers nimble and warm. Elin moved about her kitchen, humming a Swedish tune, the butter on her counter soft and spreadable. The scene was one of impossible, revolutionary domesticity. They weren't surviving the cold. They were ignoring it. They were simply living, their lives untouched by the brutal siege outside. On the 10th day of the polar outbreak, Harmon Briggs loaded his sleigh. Several families on the outskirts were low on flour and salt pork, and one had a child burning with fever. It was a dangerous trip, but Briggs was a responsible man. His route took him past the strange double cabin of the Swede. As he approached, he could see the place looked almost deserted, the single plume of smoke from the chimney looking pitifully inadequate against the vast, gray sky. He shook his head, imagining the misery inside. His path required him to guide his horse through the 4-foot gap between the two structures. He pulled his collar up, bracing for the wind tunnel effect he knew he'd find there, a blast of concentrated cold trapped between the walls. He clicked the reins, and the horse stepped into the breezeway. And then Briggs felt it. It was so unexpected that he physically flinched, pulling back on the reins. The sleigh stopped. There was no wind. The air in the narrow passage was utterly still. More than that, it was warm. A palpable, radiant heat washed over the left side of his body, then the right. It was like stepping unexpectedly into a patch of sunlight. He sat there for a long moment, utterly bewildered. The temperature outside the gap was 32 degrees below zero, a cold that felt like a physical blow. Inside this small space, it felt like a mild autumn afternoon. He looked at the source, the raw, exposed fieldstone of the massive chimney. He swung himself down from the sleigh, his heavy boots crunching on the snow. He pulled off his thick leather glove, ignoring the immediate biting sting of the cold on his fingers. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the chimney stone. He had expected to feel the soul-sucking cold of frozen rock. What he felt was a deep, steady, impossible warmth. It was not hot, not enough to burn, but it was vibrant with stored energy. It felt alive. He pressed his hand against it, soaking in the heat, trying to reconcile the feeling with a lifetime of experience that told him this could not be. A stone wall, exposed to this air, should be a monument to the cold. This one was a furnace. He stood there, and alone between the two silent cabins, and understood that everything he thought he knew about heat and cold and survival was wrong. The quiet Swede was not a fool. He was a genius. That evening, a knock came at Anders's door. It was Harmon Briggs. He did not look angry or smug. He looked humbled. He held a small sack of horehound candy for the children and a plug of tobacco for Anders. "Lindqvist," he said, stepping inside and immediately unbuttoning his greatcoat in the enveloping warmth. "I need you to show me." Anders simply nodded. He led Briggs to the great stone wall that dominated the room. "The fire heats the stone," Anders said. "The stone heats the house." "But both houses?" Briggs asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity. For an answer, Anders took a damp wool shirt that Elin had been meaning to hang. He pressed it flat against the warm stone wall. Briggs watched, his eyes wide, as a small cloud of steam instantly rose from the fabric. The damp patch began to shrink before his eyes. In less than 2 minutes, Anders lifted the shirt. It was bone dry. "It does the same thing on the other side," Anders said quietly. "For my neighbor." He smiled slightly, indicating the other cabin where his own family lived. Briggs reached out and laid his own hand on the wall, feeling the undeniable warmth. He looked from the stone to Anders's calm, patient face. He finally grasped the elegant reversal of the design. Anders hadn't tried to trap hot air. He had built a home around a captive piece of the sun. The quotable, memorable line came to him then, a perfect crystallization of what he had just witnessed. "My God, man," Briggs said, in his voice full of awe. "You didn't build a chimney, you built a memory for the fire." The story of Anders Lindqvist's warm house spread through the valley, first as rumor, then as fact, carried by the unimpeachable testimony of Harmon Briggs himself. But its journey beyond their small community began with Reverend Miller. The pastor, making his rounds to check on his flock during the worst of the cold snap, had stopped at the Lindqvist home, expecting to offer prayers and perhaps a bit of his own firewood. He found a family in such complete comfort that he stayed for 2 hours, drinking hot coffee and marveling at a phenomenon that felt like a minor miracle. Reverend Miller was a practical man as well as a spiritual one. He saw in Anders's design not just ingenuity, but a gift that needed to be shared, a matter of public health and Christian charity. When the cold broke, he sat down and wrote a long, detailed letter. He was not an engineer, but he described what he had seen with a layman's clarity: the 2 small cabins, the massive central chimney, the serpentine flue Anders had described to him, and the incredible results in fuel savings and comfort. He wrote of children playing on the floor in the dead of winter, a scene of domestic bliss that would resonate powerfully with every family on the frontier. He made copies of the letter and sent them with a traveling merchant to his colleagues in 3 neighboring parishes, one in Eau Claire, another in Menominee, and a third downriver in Durand. The letter was read from the pulpit in each of these churches. It was discussed after services, its details debated and dissected by farmers and loggers who knew the brutal reality of a Wisconsin winter. The idea, the core principle, took root. That following spring and summer, a change could be seen in the valley's building habits. While no one copied Anders's design exactly, the principle began to appear in new constructions and renovations. Men started building their new chimneys more centrally inside their homes. They built them larger, with thicker walls, trying to capture more of the heat. The Lindqvist chimney, as it came to be known, wasn't a blueprint. It was a concept. By the autumn of 1877, 14 families in the region had built variations on the theme, bringing the thermal mass of their hearths inside the insulated walls of their homes. When the results were immediate, they reported burning 40 to 50% less wood while enjoying a level of warmth they had never known before. The mockery had lasted a single season. The validation would last for generations. What Anders Lindqvist accomplished in 1876 was a remarkable piece of intuitive engineering, an innovation that anticipated modern building science by nearly a century. He didn't have the language of British thermal units or R values, but he fundamentally understood the concepts. His central chimney was a perfect example of a masonry heater.